Before we dive in, we're just steps away from 1,000 subscribers. If you're new here, hit subscribe because this story is worth staying for. A pharaoh carved his enemies' faces into stone forever. Their bones, when scientists finally found them, told a very different story than the one carved above them. At the Temple of Medinet Habu in Egypt, reliefs dated to around 1175 BCE show a coalition of raiders arriving by sea and by land, in chariots and reed boats, families and cattle in tow. Egyptian scribes gave this coalition names that had never appeared in any record before that moment. Peliset, Tieker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, Shurdan, Ekwesh, Luka. 8 names, no prior homeland confirmed for any of them, no earlier mention in any Egyptian, Hittite, or Mesopotamian archive. They simply appear, fully formed, at the exact moment the interconnected superpowers of the Bronze Age start collapsing. The Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, the port city of Ugarit, the island of Cyprus, all within a single human generation, somewhere between 1200 and 1150 BCE. For roughly 3,000 years, that carving was the closest anyone had to an eyewitness account. Historians built entire textbook chapters out of stone reliefs and burned foundation layers. Then, in 2019, a team of geneticists did something no one had managed before. They opened tombs. They extracted actual human DNA from actual bodies belonging to one branch of this coalition, the Peliset, better known by their later name, the Philistines, at the port city of Ashkelon. And the results did not simply confirm that a migration happened. They showed something almost nobody had predicted. Whatever foreign genetic signal had arrived, it had essentially vanished from the population within 200 years. If people really crossed the sea in enough numbers to help bring down half the Bronze Age world, why did it take 3,000 years and one small graveyard of infants for science to catch even a trace of them at all? For most of the 20th century, the story historians told was simple, almost too simple. Around 1300 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean functioned as a single interconnected system. Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece, the trading port of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, the copper-rich island of Cyprus, all of them linked by palace economies trading tin, copper, and grain across thousands of miles of open water. Then, within roughly 50 years, nearly all of it came apart. Ugarit was burned and never resettled. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, collapsed and was abandoned. The Mycenaean palaces at Pylos and Mycenae were destroyed. Cyprus was disrupted beyond recognition. Egyptian records from this window, the Merneptah stele, dated to around 1207 BCE, and Ramesses III's own inscriptions from his 8th regnal year, around 1175 BCE, describe waves of raiders arriving by sea and by land, pressing directly into the Nile Delta itself. The explanation that stuck, for well over a century, traced back to the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero, who in 1881 coined the phrase that would define the entire narrative, the Peuples de la Mer, a single unified confederation. One coalition, sweeping across the Mediterranean like a tide, toppling empire after empire as it went. Clean, simple, textbook ready. Under that model, the Peliset, one of the 8 named groups, were pushed back by Egypt and settled instead along the coast of Canaan, founding the cities of Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath. In time, they became the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible, the archenemies of the Israelites, the people who sent Goliath into battle against David. Archaeologists pointed to real evidence to back this up. A sudden shift in Ashkelon's material culture in the early 12th century BCE. New pottery styles that closely resembled Aegean and Mycenaean wares. New architectural layouts. New culinary habits. Pig bones showing up in food waste where there had been none before. One people. One migration. One collapse. The story was neat, and for 100 years, neat was good enough. But when scientists finally got their hands on actual human remains from the very people said to be at the center of this invasion, actual bones, actual DNA, the pattern that came back did not look like a single, unstoppable wave at all. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2016, at the port of Ashkelon, archaeologists found something they had been searching for since 1985, an actual Philistine cemetery. The Leon Levy expedition, first led by Lawrence Steger and later by Daniel Master of Wheaton College, had spent 3 decades excavating the site without ever locating where the Philistines actually buried their dead. That year they finally found it, roughly 210 individuals dated across the 11th through 9th centuries BCE. It was the first confirmed Philistine burial ground ever discovered. 3 years later, in July of 2019, an international team led by Michael Feldman and Johannes Krauss of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, working alongside Daniel Master, published something unprecedented in the journal Science Advances: genome-wide data extracted from 10 individuals, spanning from the Bronze Age all the way through the Iron Age at Ashkelon. This alone was a milestone. The southern Levant's climate, hot, humid, corrosive, is one of the worst environments on Earth for preserving ancient DNA. No one had ever successfully recovered genome-wide data from this population before. Getting even 10 usable genomes out of that ground was, in itself, a technical breakthrough. Think of DNA the way you'd think of a family recipe passed down for generations. Each ingredient a fragment inherited from an ancestor, and researchers reading the mix of ingredients in a single genome the way a food historian might taste a stew and identify which grandmother's kitchen it came from. That's roughly what admixture means here. A genetic signature made up of components from different ancestral populations, all blended together in one individual. And what the researchers found first, in the earlier Bronze Age skeletons, those buried before 1200 BCE, was exactly what anyone would expect. A genetic profile consistent with the local Levantine and Canaanite population that had lived in that region for centuries. Expected. Unremarkable. Exactly what the before picture of any invasion story should look like. Then came the anomaly. 4 infants, buried beneath Philistine houses in the early Iron Age, the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, right in the window when the Peliset were supposed to have arrived, carried something the earlier Bronze Age skeletons did not: a detectable European-related genetic component. Researchers modeled it as most consistent with a source population from southern Europe, patterns that echo Iron Age Greece, Sardinia, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula. Though the team was careful to frame this as probability, not certainty, since the precise source population could not be pinned to one single place with the data available. This is the part the records don't explain, and it recontextualizes everything you just heard about a clean, textbook invasion. The genetic pulse is real, it's measurable. It lines up almost exactly with the moment the pottery changes, the moment the architecture changes, the moment new recipes appear in the kitchen waste. But it isn't present in every burial. It's a minority signal, detected in only a handful of individuals, and it is already losing strength within the very same generation it appears in, not by years, by centuries. By the time researchers tested remains from the later Iron Age II cemetery, the one discovered in 2016, spanning the 10th through 9th centuries BCE, that European-related signal had disappeared entirely, not diminished, gone, fully absorbed into the surrounding Levantine gene pool, as though it had never arrived at all. So the DNA does say something crossed the sea, but something arrived and an empire-toppling invasion are not the same claim. And the leading scientific explanation for what actually happened turns out to be far messier than anything carved into a temple wall at Medinet Habu. The first theory says the population was real, but it was never as large as the legend. This is the systems collapse migration model, most closely associated with archaeologist Robert Drews of Vanderbilt University, and echoed in the interpretive framing Feldman's own team applied to their 2019 data. Under this reading, a relatively small mobile population, plausibly a few thousand people, arriving over the span of 1 or 2 generations, not a single overwhelming horde, moved by sea from the Aegean world and southern Europe into the Levant, swept along by the same wider chaos that was already tearing apart the Bronze Age system. The Iron Age infants at Ashkelon under this model represent exactly that: a real, physical migration, merging into the local population within a generation or 2 of arrival. But the numbers refuse to cooperate with the scale of the legend. The entire 2019 genetic dataset rests on just 10 individuals, spread across 3 separate time periods. A sample far too small to prove an invasion capable of toppling multiple fortified cities. And the European component itself was already undetectable within roughly 2 centuries, gone by the time the 10th century cemetery population was tested. A population large enough to conquer and resettle Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza should leave behind a genetic footprint that lasts centuries, not generations. This one didn't. The material evidence still backs up an arrival. The Aegean-style pottery, the new loom weights, the new cooking habits don't appear out of nowhere. Something did land on that coast, and it landed with families, not just soldiers. But the archaeological record of an invasion and the genetic record of a small, fading pulse are describing two very different scales of event, and right now, science can't fully reconcile them. If the people blamed for one of history's most infamous invasions arrived in numbers too small to explain the scale of destruction laid at their feet, something else has to account for why an entire interconnected Bronze Age world burned down in the very same decades they show up on the record. And the second explanation doesn't just complicate this story, it undercuts the idea that there was ever a single Sea Peoples invasion at all. And it doesn't take much digging before the invasion label itself starts to look shaky. Because if a population too small to conquer anything still shows up in the genetic record at exactly the moment everything else is burning, the question changes. It's no longer who invaded us, it's what was already breaking before anyone arrived at all. The second theory doesn't need an army. It needs a drought. Historian Eric Klein of George Washington University laid out the case in his 2014 book, 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed. The idea that the Bronze Age didn't fall to a single enemy at all, but to something closer to a slow-motion pileup. Paleoclimate data pulled from pollen cores and lakebed sediment across the eastern Mediterranean point to a prolonged mega-drought setting in around 1250 to 1200 BCE, reduced rainfall stretching across Anatolia, Greece, and the Levant for decades, not seasons. Layer earthquake clusters on top of that. Layer internal rebellions on top of that. Layer the collapse of the long-distance trade routes that every palace economy in the region depended on just to make bronze. Because bronze needs tin, and almost none of that tin came from anywhere near where it was used. Pull one thread out of a system that interdependent, and the whole thing doesn't just wobble. It comes apart at every seam simultaneously. Under this model, the peoples the Egyptians carved into their temple walls weren't the cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of it. Displaced communities, pushed out by the same famine and instability already gutting their own homelands, arriving in Egypt and the Levant not as conquerors with a plan, but as refugees and opportunists caught inside a catastrophe none of them started. And here's where it stops being a footnote and starts undoing what you just heard. If the people labeled invaders were themselves fleeing collapse, then the genetic pulse detected at Ashkelon was never evidence of conquest to begin with. It's evidence of the same regional disaster simply washing bodies from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, with Ashkelon standing in as just one visible landing point, one lucky excavation, in what was very likely a much wider, much messier pattern of displacement that no one has tested for yet. Every other landing point along that coastline is still sitting in the ground, ungenotyped, unread. Still, this model has a gap of its own. A drought explains why a system collapses. It does not explain why Egyptian scribes bothered writing down 8 separate names for the people showing up at their border. Peliset, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, Cheker, Luka, Ekwesh, as if they were tracking distinct groups with distinct origins, not one undifferentiated wave of the displaced. The third theory, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, doesn't require a single migration at all, because at least one of those 8 names has a history that breaks the entire timeline apart. The Shurdan, supposedly one of the Sea Peoples arriving to attack Egypt around 1175 BCE, actually appear in Egyptian records more than a century earlier, already serving as mercenaries inside Ramesses II's own army at the Battle of Kadesh, around 1274 BCE. Not raiders, soldiers, on the payroll, fighting for the very empire they'd later be blamed for attacking. That single fact reframes everything. Some researchers, including the more revisionist voice of scholar Eberhard Zanger, have argued, and this remains a contested minority position, not consensus, that the Egyptian ethnonyms may never have described one migration, one homeland, or one journey at all. Some of these groups may have already been living and working inside the Bronze Age world for generations, as soldiers, traders, or settlers, long before any scribe decided to lump them together under one dramatic label. If that's true, Sea Peoples was never really a people. It was a filing category, a bureaucratic catch-all, applied after the fact to a scattering of groups with genuinely different origins, different timelines, and different reasons for showing up where they did. It's worth being honest about where the evidence actually stands. No ancient DNA has ever been recovered from Shurdan, Shekelesh, Denyen, or Weshesh context specifically. Not one genome from any of them. This theory rests entirely on texts carved in stone and patterns in pottery, not on a single strand of genetic material. Researchers are careful to frame it as a plausible reading of incomplete evidence, not a proven fact, which means the only hard genetic data anyone has from any of these 8 named groups still comes from one coastal city, Ashkelon. Picture standing in that city in the summer of 1177 BCE. The granaries near the harbor sit half empty. The merchant ships that used to arrive loaded with Cypriot copper and painted Aegean pottery aren't coming as often anymore, and when they do, fewer of them are Egyptian. The layer of ash beneath your feet, the one archaeologists would later read like a page in a book, marks a fire that swept through sometime in the early 12th century BCE, and what gets rebuilt on top of it doesn't look like what burned. New house layouts, new styles of cooking vessels turning up in the debris, shaped and fired the way pottery was shaped and fired across the Aegean, not the way it had always been made here. You might be one of the new arrivals. Or you might be one of the Canaanite families who has lived on this coast for generations, watching strangers move into the house 3 doors down, watching unfamiliar spices show up in the market stalls, watching a shrine go up for a god your grandparents never prayed to, standing uneasily beside the ones they did. What the cooking vessels tell you is not what the temple inscriptions tell you. Cookware isn't what a raiding party carries. It's what a household carries. People planning to stay, to cook the way they always have, to raise children in a place they intend to call home. Among those children, buried centuries later beneath the floors of these very houses, are the 4 infants whose bones a research team would eventually test 3,200 years after they were laid to rest. Within 2 or 3 generations, the children born in these mixed households carry ancestry from both worlds folded together. Within another century past that, the distinctive European signal fades into the surrounding Levantine population almost entirely, not erased by force but absorbed, generation by generation, until there's nothing left to distinguish. Here is what the test results actually rewrote. And it isn't who won. Because the deeper you sit with this evidence, the more it dismantles the very premise the entire 140-year-old narrative was built on. There was very likely never one Sea Peoples event. There were overlapping, staggered movements of different groups, on different timelines, for different reasons. Refugees fleeing drought, mercenaries turned settlers, opportunists catching a system while it was down, and Egyptian scribes folded all of it into a single dramatic story, because a single dramatic story fits better on a temple wall than a decade-by-decade account of regional collapse. The genetic evidence carries its own twist inside it. The very same European-related ancestry pulse that seemed, at first glance, to prove the invasion happened, also proves that the invasion, in the sense of a conquering dominant population imposing itself for generations, did not last. A population that truly conquers and rules a place tends to leave a genetic footprint that persists for centuries. This one didn't. It dissolved in roughly 200 years. The newcomers were absorbed by the people they supposedly displaced. Not the other way around, not conquerors, guests who stayed, which means the Philistines who show up centuries later in the Hebrew Bible, the arch-enemies of Israel, the people behind Goliath, were by that point, genetically and culturally overwhelmingly Levantine. The label foreign invader had outlived the actual foreign ancestry by hundreds of years. One of the oldest us versus them conflicts ever recorded was, at the level of DNA, largely a conflict between 2 populations that had already absorbed each other generations before the stories about them were even written down. Daniel Master, who spent 3 decades searching for that cemetery before finally finding it in 2016, has described the excavation less as solving a mystery than as finally being able to ask the people themselves, instead of the pharaohs who wrote about them. It's a small shift in framing. It matters enormously. For 3,000 years, every account of who these people were came from their enemies, their conquerors, or their descendants' scripture. The bones were the first time anyone let them speak for themselves, and even then, only in fragments. The Bronze Age collapse itself starts to look less like barbarians at the gate, and more like a fragile, tightly wound system failing under climate stress, with human migration showing up not as the cause of the fall, but as one of its symptoms. Every civilization that has ever called another people invaders has, at some point in its own history, been the invader in somebody else's story. The same pattern that plays out at Ashkelon. A population arrives, stays distinct for a generation or 2, then dissolves into the people around it. Repeats itself again and again across the human record. From post-Roman Britain to the steppe migrations that reshaped Central Asia centuries later. Each time, complicating the simple version where there's a clear conqueror and a clear conquered. Identity, at the level of DNA, keeps turning out to be far more fluid and far less permanent than the stone inscriptions and sacred texts built on top of it ever suggested. and what we actually know so far is startlingly small. One cemetery, 10 individuals. One coastal city tested out of an entire Mediterranean-wide collapse that Egyptian scribes blamed on 8 distinct named peoples spread across 3 continents. The Shurdan, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, the Cheker, the Lucca, the Ekwesh. Every one of them remains, genetically speaking, a complete silence. No labs have opened their tombs. No genomes have been read. Their story is still buried in the ground, waiting on a shovel and a sequencer that haven't found them yet. History is a photograph developed from whatever fragments happen to survive. And right now, we're holding a photograph with only one corner in focus. The rest still submerged in the developing tray, waiting to resolve. Scientists finally tested one branch of the Sea Peoples, and the results didn't just answer an old question. They rewrote what history thought it already knew, and left 7 more names on that temple wall still waiting for someone to ask them the same question.